Salam dosto. Welcome to my channel, Heard Unheard, the Lit Studio. First of all, let me take this opportunity to thank all of you for making this channel and my podcast successful. I've been getting suggestions, and keeping those in mind, I've designed a series of conversations with the literary artists, literary writers, and scholars. So please keep watching the channel and do subscribe to it in case you haven't already. So, for the first conversation in the series, I'm delighted to have with me today Professor Mehr Afshan Farooqi, author of Ghalib, A Wilderness at My Doorstep, a critical biography. The book was published early this year by Penguin and has already garnered rave reviews and accolades by historians, literati, and poetry enthusiasts alike. Professor sorry. Professor Farooqi teaches Urdu and South Asian literature in the Department of Middle Eastern and South Asian Languages and Cultures at the University of Virginia. A well-known anthologist, translator, and columnist, she is also the editor of a two-volume pioneering work, the Oxford India Anthology of Modern Urdu Literature. She has also authored a very significant work in contemporary Urdu studies titled The Post-Colonial Mind, Urdu Culture, Islam, and Modernity in Muhammad Hassan Askari. As far as Professor Farooqi's latest work on Ghalib is concerned, let me borrow from Muhammad Asim Siddiqui Sahib, who writes in his review of Professor Farooqi's book that it could have been written only by a scholar who has spent a lifetime studying Ghalib, untying the knots of his difficult poetry and looking for both his extant manuscripts and lost divans. The writing of such a book also required an investigator with a command over English, Urdu, Persian, and knowledge of a smattering of Arabic. I reckon that Professor Siddiqui has put it succinctly, and I have no reasons to disagree with him. So let me welcome Professor Mehr Afshan Farooqi to open her heart about her book, which is on Ghalib. Adab, Professor Farooqi. I welcome you to Heard Unheard, the Lit Studio, on behalf of my team and subscribers. मैं तहे दिल से आपका शुक्रगुजार हूँ कि आपने हमसे रूबरू होने के लिए वक्त निकाला. So I really appreciate that you've taken time out of your busy schedule to be here. Okay, so first questions first. And no, it's a done to death kind of a question, and you must have got tired answering this question. I don't know how many times, but I'm still asking you this question. And this would be: would you tell us when did your love affair with poetry begin? Especially with Urdu, but generally, you
know. Well, first of all, adab and namaskar to all the listeners here and all the audience, and particularly to Vikram. A big thank you for this warm introduction. I don't think I deserve so much praise. But anyways, thank you. It's good to hear this. This question about my love affair with poetry, it began actually when I just started talking. It might seem very exaggerated, but it is true, because I was born in a household where poetry and literature were considered to be the most important things in our lives. And so as soon as I started talking, my father in particular made me memorize some verses, some ashar. And I was barely 2 years old at that time. And obviously I had a brand new memory. All my memory cells were very active, and everything that I memorized in those early years of my life, from the age of 2 to 10, I would say, I still remember very well. So I began to, as a child, when I memorized poetry, it was a very visual thing for me. I would think of the meaning only in visual terms. For instance, I recall that when I memorized the share, उल्टी हो गई सब तदबीरें कुछ न दवा ने काम किया देखा इस बीमारी दिल ने आखिर काम तमाम किया तो मैं सोचती थी कि उल्टी हो गई मैंने वो सब तस्वीरें वॉमिट आउट हो गई और दवा ने कोई काम नहीं किया तो आई नेवर ऑफ कोर्स रिवर्स हो जाना इसी तरह से एक और शेर था खोल जुल्फे जो वो गुलरू सर बाजार चला हर तरफ शोर उठा मार चला मार चला so again I had this visual imagery but as I grew older my father took special pains to instruct me in classical Urdu poetry and he would teach me and my little sister whenever he had the time and so slowly the appreciation began to grow. But it was only when I became a professional teacher, I would say, a person who was teaching at the university, that I began to really fall in love with poetry in a very big way. And not just Urdu poetry, but also Persian poetry and also English poetry, of course, and poetry in all languages. And I started doing translations, and all of these activities brought me very, very close to poetry. So I feel that I have internalized poetry, and it is very much, it sort of flows in my blood. It's like the water that I drink, it's very close to me.
Yeah. So I can completely understand. Coming from a family where there was literature, where there was poetry, there were poets perhaps coming to your place, reciting. It's natural for someone who's grown in that kind of a mahal to become what you've actually become. So, and I can perfectly, I can relate with it perfectly well. I had a bit of my uh, experience of theater and literature and poetry, just like you had. Uh, so, okay, that brings me to another question, which is of course related to your love for poetry. So, what prompted you to carry out, as you just said that you fell in love with poetry, not just in Urdu but also in Persian, in Angrezi, in English, and various other languages, perhaps even in translation. So, what prompted you to carry out a study on Ghalib's poetry, and not just his poetry, but also on his life, when there were other poets, other Urdu poets who were perhaps as good as Ghalib, if not better? मसलन मीर तो खुद मसलन गालिब तो मीर के बारे में खुद ही कहते हैं कि देखते कि तुम्हें उस्ताद नहीं हो गालिब कहते हैं अगले ज़माने में कोई मीर भी था so why गालिब for you?
हम्म मैं आपको एक राज की बात बताऊं attention to Bangladesh it just happened by pure chance because जब मैं यहाँ पर पढ़ाने लगी अमेरिका में आकर के तो ज़्यादातर जो स्टूडेंट्स थे वो मॉडर्न पोइट्री पढ़ना चाहते थे तो मुझे और मैंने मॉडर्न उर्दू पोइट्री पढ़ी तो थी लेकिन बहुत गहराई से नहीं पढ़ी इसलिए मैंने कई साल तक सिर्फ मॉडर्न पोइट्री ही पढ़ी और पढ़ाई और उसकी वजह से मैंने वो एंथोलॉजी भी जिसका आपने जिक्र किया है द ऑक्सफोर्ड एंथोलॉजी ऑफ मॉडर्न उर्दू लिटरेचर 2 वॉल्यूम्स में पहले तो मुझे ऑक्सफोर्ड ने कहा था कि 1 वॉल्यूम में ही कीजिए लेकिन फिर मैं जब काम करने लगी तो मैंने देखा कि इतना ज़्यादा कुछ है तो मैंने उनको परसुएट किया कि नहीं मुझे 2 वॉल्यूम्स में तो उन्होंने बहुत जनरसली मुझे परमिशन दी तो मुझे गालिब तो खैर बहुत पसंद थे मीर भी इकबाल भी आप कहिए तो मोमिन ये सारे क्लासिकल पोएट्स मुझे बहुत पसंद है but the idea of actually writing a book on Ghalib had never occurred to me. Mostly because there's been so much that's been done on Ghalib. There have been also in Urdu and in English also. There's Ralph Russell and Khurshidul Islam. They've done a really good book, Ghalib Life and Letters, and it goes into a lot of details. There's also Pawan Kumar Verma's book on Ghalib. There is there is Frances Pritchett's website on Ghalib. She's a commentator. So I just didn't think that there was any need to do a book on Ghalib. But what happened was that Frances Pritchett was retiring, and there was going to be a conference in her honor, and I was invited to give a paper. So I thought, I have to do something that has not been done before. And then I remembered from my childhood memorizing a ghazal which my father had selected, and he had told me that ये गालिब का मुस्तरद कलाम है. तो मुस्तरद लफ्ज बहुत बड़ा लफ्ज है 9-10 साल के बच्चे के लिए, और वो मुझे उन्होंने बताया कि मुस्तरद का मतलब है वो कलाम जो उन्होंने अपने दीवान में शामिल नहीं किया. तो ये बात मेरे ध्यान में रही, और मैं जब ये पेपर लिखने के लिए मैंने सोचा, तो मैंने सोचा कि चलो मुस्तरद कलाम के ऊपर एक पेपर लिखते हैं. मैंने सोचा कि होंगी 20-25-50 गजलें होंगी और अच्छा सा पेपर बन जाएगा इस पर. लेकिन जब मैंने उसको रिसर्च करना शुरू किया तो मुझे बहुत ही हैरत हुई कि गालिब का जो मुस्तरद कलाम है, यानी द पोएम्स, द वर्क्स, the verses that he did not include in his divan are actually more than the ones that he. Almost more than half of his work is in the mustarad. So that in itself was a huge shock for me, but it really spurred me on to. It made me very curious कि ऐसा क्यों हुआ, ऐसा क्यों किया गालिब ने. और बहुत जल्दी ही मुझे समझ में आ गया कि जो मुस्तरद कलाम है वो काफी मुश्किल है, काफी फारसी ज़दा है, काफी उसमें इजाफतें बहुत ज्यादा हैं, आसानी से समझ में नहीं आता. तो लेकिन उसके बावजूद बहुत सारी गजलें ऐसी थी जो बहुत साफ भी थी. तो आसानी से नहीं आता था कि why he included some and not included others. I gave this paper, and it was very well liked, and the idea of writing a book came to my mind, mostly on the Mustarad Kalam, and so that was the beginning of my work.
That's rather an unusual sort of initiation into a poet. But I can very well understand that, because when you imagine working on Ghalib or Shakespeare, for instance, you realize, I mean, they're done to death. Yeah. So I was asking Professor Farooqi, you talked about and you've written about the rejected verse of Ghalib, and that shows the greatness of Ghalib himself. How great a poet is. If even a poet's rejected verse is worth reading and worth researching, would you like to tell us something about the rejected verses of Ghalib, or perhaps recite?
Yeah, sure, of course. I'm trying to think where I should begin, because it's been so much with me for so long. Yes, so when we are thinking about this process of putting together a divan, first of all, we have to remember that what is exactly a divan? So a divan is a collection of poems that has been arranged according to the alphabet. And the alphabet is according to the radif, that is the refrain. So for example, if a verse ends in aya, then it's with the ye. So the way it goes on is that the first thing is that aya means if it is ending with an alif, right? Ye alif aya. So those verses will be arranged under alif, then under be, then under te. So all the letters of the alphabet have to be included. Only then can a poet become a sahibe divan. So it needs a lot of skill to be able to write verses in all the alphabet, with refrains in all the letters of the alphabet. And there are some that just won't fit. So when you look at Ghalib's divans, you find that he tried his best to make adjustments within those categories. So even when the ghazals are arranged, he tries to make sure that a very difficult ghazal ending with alif is followed by a somewhat easier one. Now I'll tell you something. If his divan was arranged purely according to the alphabetical order, strictly according to, absolutely, then नक्श फरियादी है किसकी शोखी है तहरीर का कागजी है पैराहन हर तय करे तस्वीर का. It won't be the first ghazal because it ends with ka, so kaf and alif, and there might be some other verse that might be ending with ba, which will be better than above ka. So these are the technicalities. But my point is that we have become so used to seeing, picking up Ghalib's Diwan and seeing that it begins with Naqsh Faryadi hai kiski shokhi hai tahrir ka, that if you change that order, we don't like it. I personally, have tried it, with many people, and it just doesn't please us whenever this is changed in any way. So that is something that I have studied in my work. This making of a divan, how it is put together. So my point is that at different periods of time, when these different divans are there, they are giving us actually snapshots of Ghalib at those times, like in 1816, in 1821, in 1826, 1828, and 1841, when the first one is published, and it goes up to 1862. So after 1841, he had made the cut from his early verses. And I'll recite one of them, which has become very popular, even though it is not included in the Divan. And it's very interesting that when the government of India issued a postage stamp on Ghalib's centenary, that was the verse that it was printed on the stamp. है कहाँ तमन्ना का दूसरा कदम यारब, है कहाँ तमन्ना का दूसरा कदम यारब, हमने दश्त इम्का को एक नक्शे पा पाया. This whole ghazal has been rejected by Ghalib. Where is the second step of imagination, O Lord? I found the I found the desert of possibilities. Dashte imna ko ek nakshe pa paya. I found the desert of possibilities to be a mere footprint. That means, it refers to that story, when the whole universe was measured in 3 steps by Barman. And so he rejected it, I believe, because papaya was not considered to be a very smart Radif, and it was considered to be a flaw. There were so many little things that were coming into play when these things were being done. But my point is that he wrote, his output was most in his early years. And after that, he started writing in Persian. So from 1828 to 1848, for 20 years, he wrote mostly in Persian. All his poetry was in Persian. And then he was appointed to the court of Bahadur Shah Zafar, and he was forced to again return to Urdu. And then he composed in Urdu again. And by then, 1857 happens very soon after that. And the world has changed. British Raj, Queen Victoria आ जाती, मलका विक्टोरिया, और सब चीजें बदल जाती हैं. बहादुर शाह जफर को रंगून भेज दिया जाता है, तो गालिब के पेट्रेनेज वहां से खत्म हो जाता है. तो उसके बाद की जो उनकी शायरी है वो थोड़ी कम है, और जाहिर है वो ज़ईफ़ भी हो रहे थे, तो आउटपुट भी कम हो गई थी। उस वक़्त उन्होंने लेटर राइटिंग ज़्यादा की थी।
I'll
अ,
come to the letter writing a little later because I
mhm,
want to talk about
sure.
that. But a very related question that you've just said is, when I read Ghalib or when I read even your book, and I've read others also, and you've very rightly you've talked about this journey from Urdu to Persian and back to Urdu. I mean, that's how you've also designed your chapters. I know because the last chapter perhaps talks about his return to
Mhm.
Urdu. So, I find I don't know, I may be completely wrong. I find a little contradiction in Ghalib's choice of language. Because Ghalib was a writer who was ambitious in a sense. All through his life, he was struggling, for acknowledgement by the court, by the Bacha, by the poets. And people would say, obscure hai, difficult hai, ye hai and wo hai. So what I'm trying to say is when Ghalib was ambitious, why did he then choose to write in Persian, which was already losing its way in India, and not in Urdu? Post it's when he was in his prime youth. I mean, if you could just.
This is a very good question, and I struggled with this question when I was writing my book because Hali, who has written Ghalib's first biography, Altaf Hussain Hali, his book is called Yadgar Ghalib. He was the one who raised this question that, why did Mirza start writing in Farsi? When Farsi was really losing favor in India, it was in the state of decline in the sense that people were not studying Farsi. The answer to this question is that it is a difference between a classical language and a new language and a modern language. So Farsi is a classical language, just like Sanskrit and Arabic. These are classical languages, and they are never out of date. They are never out of fashion, and there is a lot of learning in them because these languages have a very deep historical past and a very deep literary history. So Ghalib apparently, when he went to Calcutta, there he found that it was a very different literary culture there from Delhi. He found that Calcutta was the British capital in those days, and it was a very cosmopolitan city. There were lots of people from different South Central Asian countries there, and he met the Persian ambassador, and he was attending mushairas that were in Persian. So he realized that Persian has a constituency beyond India, beyond the borders of India. And Urdu is only limited basically to India. And he wanted his poetry to be read outside of India as well. So he hit upon this idea of writing in Persian, which is similar to what Iqbal did later on when he wanted to be appreciated or his message to be carried beyond. He also started writing in Persian. And Persian is a classical language. So Ghalib wrote a lot in Persian, and you'll be surprised that his Persian poetry is 5 times as much as his Urdu poetry. So he was very, very prolific. And as you pointed out, those were his prime years. He was no longer a teenager. When he finished his first divan, he was still a teenager. And when he's writing in Persian, he's a mature person. He's at the peak of his intellectual and creative energy, and he's spending it on Persian. And he wrote some really, really beautiful masnavis in Persian. One is on Banaras. It's called Chiragh-e-Dar, the lamp in the temple. And he was totally in love with Banaras when he was going to Calcutta. So he wrote that. Then he wrote another Masnavi called Abre Gohar Bar, the pearl bearing clouds. And these are very classical Masnavis. And they are quite different from his ghazals. But when he came back to Delhi and he was associated with the court, he returned to Urdu. And those were then his last years of his creative output. But there's one thing that I want to point out right now in case I forget later on. And that is that his compositions in Urdu in the later years are not so obscure. And the reason that I give for this is that he had really polished his art in the 20 years that he was writing in Persian. And maybe writing in Persian had also satisfied some part of his brain, some part of his intellectual makeup that had a hankering for Persian. So that had been satisfied, and he could return to Urdu with all his love and all his passion and all his his aptitude as a native speaker of Urdu, right? Because when you are a native speaker of a language, you can take any liberties with the language, which is what Ghalib does all the time. He's making new words, he's making new devices, he's making new phrases. Whereas in Farsi, he was very careful. He couldn't do that. It was not his native language, although he wanted to. He pretended that he knew Farsi as well as any native speaker of Farsi. But the fact of the matter is that he was a third generation Indian, and his Urdu was his primary language, Urdu Hindi. So obviously he had more facility in Urdu.
Right. So when we talk about his language, acha, usse pehle, I mean, when you talk about his love for Banaras and the way he
Mm.
expressed his love for Banaras, and in one of his memoirs, I was like, he has all praises for Banaras.
Mhm. Yeah.
वहाँ का आबो, the so much better than anywhere else in India. I mean, he has all love for Banaras that he's poured out. In fact, for Calcutta, I mean, if one looks at Ghalib and his interaction with these cities, whether you talk about Allahabad, whether you talk about Banaras, and then to Calcutta, and all of this, I guess, is happening when he's going to Calcutta,
Mhm.
when he's en route to Calcutta. And
Mhm.
Calcutta becomes perhaps one of the central sort of, a center in his poetic journey, if I may so say so, because it's only after he goes to Calcutta, it's only perhaps, and you've mentioned it, that in a mushaira where he is criticized for his usage of Persian, that
Mhm.
turn his poetic career. I mean, that came around as the
Yes. Mhm.
moon. Would you like to talk about? And he in fact wrote a masnavi after that,
Yes.
defending Persian.
Yes.
Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
talk a little about that because I think that's very significant in his poetic journey.
Yeah. So you see, Ghalib had a very modern mind, and he liked to think of things in not as objects, but as objects that can be questioned. So, for example, if this is a glass, he could say, "Is this a glass?" Something like that. So he does that. He twists things around. In Calcutta, he he presented his poems, and somebody made an objection that his language, the usage was not correct, and he was very upset by that. So he wrote a long poem called Ashti Nama. Later on, he changed the title to Bade Mukhalif, in which he says, "I am a stranger to this land. I'm a traveler from Delhi, and this is the way you are treating me. You are finding faults with my poetry. And let me tell you, this construction has been used by Sadi, it has been used by Urfi, it has been used by so and so." He gives a long list of poets who have used that construction. And now, you guys, because you don't know Persian in its modern context, that is why you don't know that it's being used. And he never forgot this whole episode. So when he went back to Delhi, this thing remained with him, and he decided that he was not going to be remembered for um, being a follower of Indian Persian. He kind of tried to make a distinction between Indian Persian and Persian, Iranian Persian, which is similar to what we have today. Like we have American English, We have British English, right? We have Indian English. We have Canadian English. We have Australian English. So similarly, Persian was not something that was only belonging to Iran. It is, it is spoken in Afghanistan. It is spoken in Central Asia. It has so many different variants. And of course, Indian Persian itself is a very, very rich language. And that is mostly because the Indians wrote so much in Farsi. They wrote dictionaries in Farsi, they wrote histories in Farsi, they wrote a whole ton of work. And Ghalib was basically being very nasty over here. It's actually, showing signs of his temperament that was bitter. He had faced opposition. He had lost his father when he was only 5 years old. After that, he lost his uncle when he was 9 years old. So he had faced a lot of adversity in life, and he was struggling, and he was surrounded by wealthy relatives. So that made his position even a little bit, strange, अजीब, क्योंकि उनकी शादी तो हुई थी बहुत ही wealthy family में, um, लेकिन उनके जो फादर इन लॉ थे वो बात सूफियाना उनकी तबीयत थी, तो वो ज्यादा इन सब चीजों में नहीं थे कि जायदाद और पैसा और ये वो। और गालिब का ये नहीं था कि गालिब बहुत ज्यादा पैसे के पीछे भाग रहे थे, लेकिन वो एक कंफर्टेबल एग्जिस्टेंस जीना चाहते थे, which he actually had, but his habits were such that he was living beyond his means. He was way living beyond his means, and that was probably a result of being a child who was, who grew up with his nana nani in his nanihal, and who had seen days of prosperity, but was not living at that level anymore in his independent life. So he was a little bit of a bitter person, and he so this whole thing developed into a big fight, and he continued to criticize Indian Persian and Indian Persianists. And there was this famous Deccan author who had written this dictionary called Burhan-e-Qatib, and Khalib wrote a rejoinder called Qatib Burhan, in which he criticized all these usages, and he said yes and yes. And at that point, he invented a tutor who he said had come from Iran long ago when he was in Agra, when Ghalib was in Agra. Abdul Samad, whose name was Hormuzd, who was a Jew who was converted to Islam, and he had come and he had taught Ghalib all the current Persian usages. So up till that point, Ghalib had not mentioned such a thing that he had had a tutor. So everyone thinks that he just made up that story. I don't know. I haven't taken a position on it. I just wonder why he would invent it so late in his life. Probably that person did exist and Ghalib did learn Persian from him. But my point is that Ghalib was, he was always trying to do something different. He was always trying to say things, witty things, आप लोगों को तो पता ही होगा उनके बारे में जो इतने लतीफे हैं कि गधा आम नहीं खाता और ये वो सारे सारे जो उनके अब हयात में हैं, और फिर हाल ही ने फिर रिपीट किए हैं यादगार गालिब में, कि वो बहुत ही विटी थे, हाजिर जवाब थे, ये सब चीजें थी उनके अंदर, लेकिन वो बहुत थोड़े से शिकस्ता दिल भी थे। हालांकि उनको अपनी जिंदगी में ही बहुत इज्जत और शोहरत और सब कुछ मिल गई थी, लेकिन उसके साथ साथ एक अंडरलाइंग वो भी था, एक बिटरनेस भी थी उनके अंदर।
So, when you talk about Khalib's usage of language, his criticism, let's say, of Indian, Persian, and related things, one thing that comes to mind is, and this is a related question, I guess, and it's about his obscurity, the so-called obscurity. अब लोग कहते हैं गालिब बहुत obscure हैं, बहुत difficult हैं. I mean, there are various truths to it. Of course, sometimes his thought may be ahead of his times. Sometimes his language may not be understood properly by the readers or the audience. So बहुत सारे वजूहात हो सकते हैं that he may be considered uh, you know an obscure poet, जैसे Robert Browning, for instance. I mean, I still remember. I think it's Robert Browning. I may be wrong, but I think it's Browning. When someone asked Browning, about a meaning of a line, a particular line in his poem, that Browning responded that when I was writing it, only two people knew the meaning. One was I, and one was the God. And now only one of them remembers the meaning, and that's perhaps the God. Even I have forgotten what I meant and that happens perhaps with poets. But when it comes to Ghalib, I really like this confidence in Ghalib that even such a is qism ka ek ilzam, he turns that into poetry. He takes pride in being difficult at times. For instance, when he writes a verse like, and again in Persian, Zabas mujle hai kalam mein mera dil, sun sun बयाने कामिल आसान कहने की करते हैं फरमाइश
मुश्किल वगर न गोयम मुश्किल हाँ
इससे बड़ी बात क्या होगी कि it's difficult to write, otherwise I mean it's really difficult to write, like an ordinary person. I mean, otherwise I can't write. Now my point is, if he were obscure for whatever reasons, perhaps for his thought, perhaps for his language, or perhaps, someone might say he was just being pedantic. He wanted to flaunt his knowledge. And I mean, I don't have any problems with that because you've read so much, you want to perhaps flaunt it. Uh, how do you reconcile? What do you reckon? Perhaps is the reason for him being obscure, or what contributes more to his, obscurity?
ये बहुत ही अच्छा सवाल है और इसका जवाब मैं उम्मीद करती हूँ कि I'll give a satisfactory answer to this because I spent a lot of time thinking about this. Why did he not follow in Meer's footsteps? Because as you know, as all our listeners probably know, Meer is the poet who brought the language of everyday use, जिसको हम रोजमर्रा कहते हैं, उन्होंने रोज बोलचाल की जबान में शायरी की, यानी उन्होंने बोलचाल की जबान को एलिवेट कर दिया शायरी की जबान पे. तो आखिर मीर was alive when Khalib was born, right? उनमें शायद मीर गालिब शायद 10 साल के थे या 12 साल के थे जब मीर का इंतकाल हुआ. और उन्होंने, जैसा आपने शुरू में भी कहा, कि एक्नॉलेज किया कि मीर बहुत बड़े शायर हैं, लेकिन उन्होंने मीर के अंदाज में शायरी नहीं की. क्यों नहीं की ऐसे उन्होंने क्यों नहीं किया? इसके बारे में मैंने जब बहुत सोचा तो मेरे समझ में ये आया कि गालिब जो थे वो एक 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 अंदाज था शायरी का फारसी में, तो हम कहते हैं ताज़ा गोई. कुछ लोग पहले सबके हिंदी यानी इंडियन स्कूल ऑफ पोइट्री भी कहते हैं. हालांकि so anyway, ताज़ा गोई was an attempt, a wave of poetry in which new ideas were being incorporated into the ghazal. क्योंकि जैसा कि आप लोग जानते हैं, गजल जो है, गजल जो सिर्फ है, उसमें स्ट्रक्चर बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट पार्ट प्ले करता है. यानी हर एक वर्स जो है वो 2 ही लाइन का होना है, 2 मिसरों का होना है, उसमें काफिया होना जरूरी है, रदीफ भी जरूरी है, हालांकि लाजमी नहीं है, लेकिन उसमें मीटर होना है, उसमें ये सब इतनी चीजें हैं. यानी वो हाईली स्ट्रक्चर्ड फॉर्म ऑफ पोएट्री है. जब पोइट्री इतनी हाईली स्ट्रक्चर्ड होगी तो उसमें नए मजमून लाना थोड़ा मुश्किल होता है. तो बहुत सारे ट्रेडिशनल मजमून हैं, उनको पॉलिश करते हैं पोएट्स और उनके नए जाविये सामने लाते हैं. आप ऐसे सोच लीजिए कि हीरा है, उसको हम पॉलिश कर रहे हैं, उसमें नए नए फेसेस ला रहे हैं. तो गालिब जो थे वो हीरा पॉलिश तो करना चाहते थे, लेकिन वो चाह रहे थे कि नई चीजें भी आ जाएं इसमें और भी. तो इसलिए उन्होंने ताज़ा गोई की जो ख्याल थी, जो पोएट्री थी, उससे उन्होंने बहुत असर लिया. एंड बेदिल वाज वन ऑफ देम. बेदिल इज 17th century पोएट और वो सूफी पोएट थे. और गालिब कोई सूफी तो नहीं थे, लेकिन उन्होंने दिल के जरिए बहुत सारे सूफी और वेदांतिक आइडियाज, यानी सूफी आइडियाज जो है, इंडियन सूफीज्म जो है, उसमें बहुत कुछ मिला जुला है ऑफ वैदिक थॉट एंड ऑल ऑफ दैट, इंडियन फिलोसॉफिकल थॉट, इट इज ऑल इंटरमिंगल। तो वहीं से गालिब ने उसमें से बोरो किया और एक तरह से उन्होंने उर्दू में ताज़ा गोई की। Now he wasn't the only poet who was doing this, except that he was different because he was using new constructions. He was playing with language a lot. He was language को बहुत twist कर रहे थे। और दूसरी बात यह है कि उनके his mind was literally overflowing with ideas, and at times he felt that language was not adequately supporting him in expressing those ideas. So he kept falling back either on Farsi or using a lot of abstraction. The reason for using abstraction, let me tell you, is that when you have to finish a thought in 2 lines, you have to compress it. And the only way to compress it is to use a metaphor, because a metaphor has a meaning that is far fetched, right? Which is invoked by the metaphor. So that is why Ghalib became obscure, because he was using a lot of metaphor and some symbols, not a whole lot of that, but mostly metaphor. And there is one verse that I want to share with you, which is हुजूम फिक्र से हुजूम फिक्र से दिल मिस्ल मौज लर्जे है हुजूम फिक्र से दिल मिस्ल मौज लर्जे है शीशा नाजुक ओ शीशा नाजुक को आप शीशा नाजुक को सहबाए आप जीना गुदास। देखिए पढ़ने में भी मुश्किल हो रही है। मौज यानी फिक्र जो है इतनी ज्यादा मेरे crowded है, the crowding of fikr is so much that my heart is undulating like a wave. शीशा नाजो को आप सहबाए आप गीना गुदास, सहबा माने शराब, शीशा माने प्याला जिसमें शराब पीते हैं। तो जिस प्याला जो प्याला है, जो रिसेप्टिकल है शराब का, तो नाजुक है, लैंग्वेज नाजुक है, और सहबा जो है, जो शराब है, वो बहुत ही हॉट और बबलिंग है। तो किस तरह से वो बबलिंग और बलते हुए ख्यालात को हम इतनी नाजुक जबान में हम किस तरह से समो दें, इसलिए मुस्तरद में से है। इसको उन्होंने नहीं शामिल किया, लेकिन ये उनकी फिलॉसफी को काफी हद तक समझाता है ये शेर कि हुजूम फिक्र से दिल मिस्ल मौज लर्जे है कि शीशा नाजो को सहबाए आप गुदाज। सहबा जो है वो गुदाज है, वो हॉट है, बबलिंग है वो, और शीशा जो है वो तो बहुत ही नाजुक है, वो टूट जाएगा। तो किस तरह जबान के अंदर वो कैपेबिलिटी कहाँ से लाएं कि वो थॉट को इनकैप्सुलेट कर पाए।
I mean, this is
It's
another level.
mind blowing, yeah.
I mean, I can only think about I mean, when you said this, and I didn't know about this particular verse.
Yes,
मुझे
it's
बिल्कुल
mustarad. If I can say something. So, you see, poetry also demands a lot of skill in language use. And Ghalib's early poetry shows the roughness of his language. Roughness in the sense that it's not very musical, stumbling over words. There is a lot of use of izafat. There is a lot of, sometimes, it seems like he is saying something simple in difficult words. That's what people say. But I don't think that is the case. The case is that his language his craft hasn't been polished as much as it needed to be. बाद में polished हो गई। और शुरू में भी मतलब उन्होंने कुछ अशार तो कुछ गज़लें तो बहुत ही अर्ली पीरियड की हैं। अर्ज़े नियाज़ इश्क के काबिल नहीं रहा, जिस दिल पे नाज था मुझे वो दिल नहीं रहा। ये सब तो उनकी अर्ली पीरियड की हैं, तो आसान भी हैं और पॉलिश भी लगती हैं, लेकिन बाय एंड लार्ज जब उनकी आउटपुट ज्यादा थी तो उनकी जबान इतनी मीठी और सुरीली नहीं थी, जितनी मीर की है, जितनी इकबाल की है, जितनी मोमिन की है. मोमिन से गालिब बहुत इम्प्रेस थे. मोमिन वॉज गालिब्स कंटेम्प्रेरी. एंड गालिब ने कहा काश मैं मोमिन मोमिन के एक शेर के लिए उन्होंने कहा था कि मैं अपना पूरा दीवान, हाँ. तो इस तरह से वो बहुत एडमायर करते थे उन लोगों को जिनकी लैंग्वेज बहुत पॉलिश. तो जब वो 20 साल तक उन्होंने जब फारसी में लिखा और इतना ज्यादा लिखा, फिर जब वो उर्दू में वापस आए तो उनकी बहुत ही पॉलिश हो गई थी गालिब की. तो मोस्ट ऑफ हिज फेमस, अ लॉट ऑफ हिज फेमस गजल्स आर फ्रॉम दैट पीरियड देन. जब
And
इतना वो आसान कहने लगे कि हंस के दुश्वार है हर काम का आसान होना, आदमी को भी मुयस्सर नहीं इंसान होना. या उसी पीरियड के बहुत सारे उनके ऐसे हैं. इब्ने मरियम हुआ करे कोई, मेरे दुख की दवा करे कोई.
I mean, of course, one can see that sort of maturity in his thought also.
Yes.
Contradiction. It's not a contradiction, but you also find a share, and I think this comes at a little, towards latter half of his life when he writes a share like "Masjid ke zere saya ek ghar bana liya, banda hai kamina हमसाया है खुदा है."
Yes, yeah, yeah,
तो
yeah.
की शायरी में वो भी मजा है.
हाँ, सबवर्सिव तो है ही है. सबवर्सिव तो शुरू से ही है वैसे.
सबवर्सिव रहे, पोएट्री तो ऑफ कोर्स रहेगी.
पोइट्री तो सबवर्सिव होनी ही चाहिए.
बिल्कुल, बिल्कुल, completely agree. Okay, I mean, one question that comes to mind is, and I think there have been so many reasons that Ghalib enjoyed a lot of popularity, and especially after his death, his popularity, I mean, there's no question about about his popularity. People may not know that this particular शेर is by Ghalib, लेकिन गालिब के अशार सबने सुने हैं. इश्क पर जोर नहीं है ये वो आतिश गालिब, किसने नहीं सुना,
बिल्कुल.
सबने सुना है. So my point is, I mean, media, films, Bollywood, music, now internet, all of that has done quite a great deal to make him more popular. What would be, one reason that you may attribute to his greatness? I mean, why is Ghalib still alive today? I mean, there are other Urdu poets also. Mir bhi hain, Zauq bhi hain. I mean, I'm talking only about Urdu poets. But what makes Ghalib so popular even today? I mean, it's a very subjective sort of a, question. Anyone would have different sort of reasons. आपके जो वजूहात हैं या एक particular reason, I mean, can you tell us that? What makes him so popular?
I I can't think of just one particular reason, but I think there could be like two or three at least. The first being that Diwane Ghalib is a very, like look at this. This is a Diwane Ghalib. It's a small book. 234 ghazals. It's not something that looks formidable. You can pick it up anytime and you can leaf through it and you can cover 10 or 20 ghazals, out of which you will like quite a few. Whereas with Mir, with Mushafi, all of these other bigger poets, they have multiple divans. Mir, for instance, has 7 divans. So you won't find somebody reading all the 7 divans. What people then rely on is intikhab Mir, a selection. So that was one thing, the smart editing process that Ghalib employed and brought to us what he considered to be his best poems. That is that was a very, very smart move. One. The second thing is that his poetry is very modern. He is not so emotional. He's more erudite. He is more questioning, and he is more concerned about existential angst And existential angst is something that really syncs with the modern mind a lot. And and it's, you know, the emotional part of ghazal poetry only pleases a certain section of the population. But the other bigger, wider section is the one that always likes to grapple with things. You know, Khalib की poetry जो है वो grapple करने की चीज है. उसको जब आप समझ में आता है आपके, तो ऐसा लगता है कि वाह, बस बाहर ही निकलता है. जैसे लगता है कि कोई एक खिड़की खुल गई है और एक ठंडी हवा अंदर आ गई है. कभी कभी तो उनका इतना जबरदस्त होती है कि वो बस दिल चाहता है कि उसी में डूब जाए. राइट. न था कुछ तो खुदा था, कुछ न होता तो खुदा होता, डुबोया मुझको होने में, न होता मैं तो क्या होता. So this whole thing about being and non-being, between existence and non-existence, which is what Ghalib does a lot. And the reason why it seems a lot, because this whole thing is compressed into 234 ghazals. So it's very intense. So the experience of reading Ghalib is very intense, and it appeals to the modern mind because our lives are very intense, and we somehow feel that poetry, which is sharing our existential angst, sort of strikes a chord in us. I think that's one of the reasons.
That's very valid, and that's why when I think whenever someone picks up Ghalib, one relates with one or the other realities of one
Mm.
with Ghalib, and that's why whether it's about as you rightly pointed out about existence and non-existence, or whether it's about
Mm.
uh, you know ईमा मुझे खींचे है ईमा मुझे रोके है जो खींचे है मुझे कुफ्र काबा मेरे पीछे है खलीसा मेरे.
कलीसा मेरे आगे.
I mean, I would still count this particular verse as a very, very kind of a not a difficult but a very contextual sort of a share. One also needs to look at why is Ghalib saying this, or what's the immediate, let's say, political social context to it. Khaba theek hai, but Kalisa, what does Kalisa mean? Does it refer to a girja? Does it refer to a church? Does it refer to something else? Does it refer
Mhm.
to, if not to a church, does it refer to, let's say, non-Khaba, or,
Yes, of course, the symbolism behind it. Yeah. Mhm.
yeah. So again, but I think towards the end now, I think one or two more questions, which really, I really felt, you've done really, really well in your book. When I was reading your book, and it's not a question, but it's just an observation, and you can respond to it only if you feel like, it's an observation. But I really found what is the most satiating thing in your book is the way you've written it, your writing style, the kind of language that you have used. you know, on the one hand, your book shows incredible erudite scholarship. There's no question about it. One shows the kind of research that has actually gone into it, the kind of academic rigor that you've had when writing this book. Yet, I think your book is still capable of capturing the attention of even the uninitiated people. I wouldn't say it's a very easy read. It's a a coffee kind of a book. It needs, of course, a certain interest, at least in poetry and Ghalib. But even if you are not an academic, if you are not a Ghalibian, if you're not a Ghalib scholar, even if you pick up, this work, I think it's extremely well written. And my question, if you want to respond to it, it's not even a question. Do you think academicians today should adopt this kind of writing style, and they should deliberately attempt to reach out to the masses? Otherwise, फिर वही बात हो जाती है, आप लिख रहे हैं, आपकी किताब एक लाइब्रेरी में बंद है, your book is locked in a library,
Mm.
only a researcher working in that field would pick it up,
Mm.
uh, and that's it. But it really doesn't reach out to the public, to the masses. But this kind of a work that we've done, I think it's really successful in reconciling that kind of a difference that exists between academicians and quote unquote the uninitiated. So many congratulations for doing that. uh, so I mean,
Thank
I don't
you.
need an
No, I
uh,
can actually answer this question. And uh, so what happened was that my previous book, when you are teaching in an American, or I mean, mostly I've been teaching in the US, I haven't taught in England. So um, there's something called tenure, which you get after. So when you're appointed as assistant professor, they give you 6 years to prove yourself. And the way you prove yourself is by publishing. And by publishing what is called the tenure book, एक किताब ऐसी हो जो बहुत ओरिजिनल हो ये वो. तो जैसा मैंने आपको शुरू में बताया कि मेरा तो शुरू से मैं जब पढ़ाने लगी तो मुझे ज़्यादा मॉडर्न पढ़ाना था, क्योंकि वो थिएटर्स ही वही थे मॉडर्न के. तो मैंने सोचा कि मैं जब उसकी क्रिटिकल थियरी पढ़ाती थी तो मुझे लगता था कि उर्दू की क्रिटिकल थियरी कोई ट्रांसलेशन में ही नहीं है, कैसे पढ़ाऊं. अगर उर्दू हिंदी अपना जो अदब है उसकी क्रिटिकल थियरी का ट्रांसलेशन होना चाहिए. तो मैंने सोचा मैं किताब किसी लिटरेरी क्रिटिक पर लिखूं. And I asked my father, because I was thinking of Iraq Gorakhpuri and also Majnu Gorakhpuri. There were many choices I had, the progressive writers. And he suggested Muhammad Hassan Askari. He said, तुम अस्करी पर लिखो, और वो बहुत ही ऐसा माइंड है जो बहुत ही इंसाइसिव है, और उनको तुम पढ़ो. So I started reading Askari, and he used to write a column every month. And in that column, he used to give such insights into literature, and not just Urdu literature, into world literature. He wrote a lot about world literature, about Indian literature, and it was always written in a very casual language. And after I had read like thousands of pages of that, I somehow got the hang of writing in a casual way. And fortunately, I was asked by Dawn, this newspaper that is published in Pakistan, to write a column. And I began to write a column for them. And again, I was imitating Askari actually by writing it in a very casual style. So through this practice of writing in a casual style, by the time I down the lane, I got tenure and everything, and I had to now write another book to get to the next level, um, and become a full professor. As you know, it was by chance that Khalib fell in my lap, and so my writing style had become in that way. Even if I tried to change it, I couldn't change it. It was just that writing style that wanted to reach to a lot of people. I wanted to reach a lot of people. And for better or worse, I wrote it in that style. And then the dilemma was whether I should go with the university press or whether I should go with a popular press. And I spent a lot of sleepless nights, and I got offers from university presses. But when they looked at the manuscript, they said that it's too long. It should be edited down. And I had spent so much hard work. I didn't want to edit it down. I didn't want to edit it down. So I said, go to hell. I'm going to go with I'm going to go with another press. And I knew Premanka Goswami from my days when my book was published from Oxford University Press, and he was with Penguin. So I just wrote him a casual email. I said, look, I have this book, and it's basically, it's a book for promotion, my promotion. So it is a literary book. And he looked at it and he said, maybe we'll publish it. So, and इतने लोगों ने मुझसे यही बात जो आप कह रहे हैं कही कि आपका लिखने का स्टाइल बहुत फ्रेंडली है. तो बस ये तो ऊपर वाले की कुछ मेहरबानी है, कुछ मेरे माँ बाप की कि उन्होंने उनसे मैंने पाया, यू नो, शौक लिखने का मुझे उन्हीं से मिला, और उन्होंने बहुत मुझे इनकरेज किया, और मैं उनको इतना याद करती हूँ अपने फादर को, अगर आज वो होते अभी गुजर गए कुछ महीने पहले। वो इतना इंतजार कर रहे थे किताब का। मैंने उनको कवर दिखाया तो इट वाज इन माय फोन, तो कहने लगे ये टेलीफोन में क्या दिखा रही हो, रियल में दिखाओ। तो मैंने कहा बस आने ही वाली है किताब, बस आने ही वाली है, और बस वो जानते हैं आप लास्ट मोमेंट्स की एडिटिंग, बल्कि बाद में मैंने ठीक से कुछ एडिटिंग भी नहीं की, वो इतने बीमार हो गए थे। जो फाइनल एडिट्स के दौरान जस्ट यू नो समहाउ इस तरह से हो गई।
It's
um,
such a big loss. I mean, of course, it's a personal loss for you, but for all of us,
yeah.
no one can fill that gap ever. And you're fortunate. I mean, uh, I don't want to say it, but I envy you. उस तरह का माहौल मिलना, to be born in such a family, to be a part of that sort of you know that kind of an atmosphere, that kind of an माहौल जहाँ पे सब कुछ poetic है, जहाँ पे literary है.
Yeah.
And of course, please don't discount and I will not want you to discount your own efforts that have actually gone into making your writing so reader friendly. When I was doing, I had this habit of writing long sentences, and my supervisor would say, it has to be reader friendly. You know, would chuck your thesis if you write like this. So it's, of course, you cultivate it with a lot of effort. And now, perhaps, when I actually published my book, I realized, similar thing happened. My book was about to come when my supervisor, and this is my PhD, thesis that I published. My supervisor passed away just a month
Oh.
before my,
Mm.
so I couldn't even show her. But I completely agree with you that this is you need to cultivate this kind of writing style, and I also tried to do that it should reach out to the masses, otherwise there's no
Yeah.
point. It's
Huh.
just libraries,
Huh.
uh, because we
That's
actually want
true.
impact on, and these are people like Ghalib, and I have written on Shakespeare, written on Khalib, but others also. I think these are popular people, and if we deny access to the masses,
Mm. Mm.
there's no point. Why write?
Yeah, you are absolutely. I just I wanted to say one last thing, which is that uh, as a female also, I mean, as a woman writing on Ghalib, I'm only the third woman who has written on Ghalib. And I dedicated my book to Frances Pritchard. She is the only woman commentator on Ghalib. And Ghalib के ऊपर कितनी commentaries हैं, बहुत हैं, 100 से ज़्यादा हैं. तो वो मुझसे कहने लगी कि तुमने वुमन कमेंटेटर कहा है, मैं नॉन नेटिव कमेंटेटर भी हूँ, मतलब जाहिर है वो उर्दू उनकी जबान नहीं है, लेकिन उन्होंने किया। और जो दूसरी खातून है वो नटालिया प्रिगरीना, रशियन, जिन्होंने गालिब पे काम किया है। सो इन अ वे लाइक आई एम द ओनली द फर्स्ट वुमन फ्रॉम द सब कॉन्टिनेंट writing on Ghalib, and honestly, uh, it never, I mean, I never thought of it in that way, but when I finished the book, then I began to to bibliography तैयार कर रही थी, तो उसमें कोई भी नहीं है, कोई
I
भी
know.
नहीं है। कमाल हो गया। To go a long way।
I know, and it's really wonderful. I mean, and for my audience, I forgot to show the book. This is the book. I've also gifted it to my friends,
Thank
and I
you।
plan to gift more of the book. I mean, to more of my friends. Uh, I'm going to order it for my library also, and perhaps use it for my classes. We have a colleague who also does course on Ghalib in you know, at Ambedkar University. So he does Ghalib. So I mean, of course, there are students who read Ghalib. So I'm sure if you are in Delhi anytime, we would love, if you could come over perhaps to the university. We would formally invite you and speak to our students, faculty about your book.
That would be so nice. Thank you so much.
It was such a pleasure meeting you, speaking to you. Actually, the way you write is also the way you speak. So I never felt
Oh.
that, that I'm talking to a prof from the US, and I have to be very careful. So it was actually a very informal sort of an interaction, and I really, really appreciate the way you spoke to us, to me, to my subscribers, and questions. One last thing, perhaps, what after Ghalib? So I'm sure there's much more, that you may have to say about Ghalib, but have you planned anything else other than Ghalib as your next project? Or you're still stuck with Ghalib?
I'm still stuck with Ghalib, and my next book is also going to be on Ghalib, because I had so much material, and also because I started actually with the rejected verses,
Right.
and the book is not about the rejected verses. Actually, the book that you have, it is more of an overall assessment of Ghalib. It's more holistic because I wanted to um, share this with the readers that you can't really evaluate Ghalib just on his Urdu verses, although Urdu he is, the most outstanding in Urdu, but there's so much more. And also I wanted to do a literary history of his divans. So the second book is going to be mostly on the rejected verses, and there are a couple of other projects that I have lined up. So
We'll have more occasions to
God
meet.
willing, yeah.
I really wish that you publish your books soon, and we'll keep inviting you.
Yes,
And,
please do. I will be coming to India in December,
wow, that's
and yes, I will be in touch with you. And
cool, cool. I think there's one last question that I forgot to ask,
hmm,
and allow me one last question.
please do. Yes,
And this,
sure.
yeah. So, when you write a biography, so a biographer needs to observe, sort of a critical distance from her subject to avoid one's own preferences, one's own prejudices, biases. And this is even more significant in the case of a critical biography, because your biography is not just a biography. It says, and in bold letters, a critical biography. So how did you negotiate it personally? I mean, and I'm assuming that Ghalib or Ghalib's poetry is your love. Like, you love Ghalib's poetry. So how difficult is it to maintain that kind of a distance?
Yeah, this is kind of a difficult question because over a period of time, like I had been working for 10 years, it's a long chunk of time, and I got, I felt very close to Ghalib. I knew so much about him. I knew what time he had his dinner. I knew what was served for his dinner. I knew what drinks he liked. He loved champagne mixed with rose water. He liked Old Tom. I don't know. He was. I learned a lot about his preferences. Um, Still, what uh, I guess I felt that I wish I knew more about the women in his life. You know, and there are only apocryphal stories about Munni or Munni Jan. I don't know who this. There was this one dancer he was enamored with, and I'm sure there must have been many more. Also, we don't know his wife lost. There was 7 children died in infancy. There must have been something wrong with the rhesus factor in her, the blood group and all that. So we don't really know the intimate details. I would have loved to know more from Ghalib about the women in his life, his mother. He does write a little bit here and there about his aunt, but we really don't know much. So that part is gone. I wasn't very happy with that.
But nothing, you didn't change your opinion about Ghalib after researching, nothing that, you know, you didn't like after knowing about Ghalib.
Not really. I mean, yeah, I learned so much. It was more of a learning curve for me. I was learning a lot about the culture. I was learning some basic questions, like one question that I found an answer to was, why do people write? And this is a big question, but I learned that at least in the times that Ghalib lived, in pre-modern times, people wrote because they wanted to be remembered by posterity. They wanted to leave their, name be remembered. So that was something, it moved me a lot, that 200 years from now, we still raving over Ghalib. I think that was something huge. It was really huge. I mean, so I feel it was a journey of discovery. Writing this book was a journey of discovery. I want to
I, re-
leave it at that.
I really hope that you have many more exciting journeys ahead, not just with Ghalib, but with other writers.
Yes, yes, if yeah, if possible. यहाँ तो मैं आपको बताऊं कितना काम करना पड़ता है हमें.
And Shukriya, Professor Farooqi, for this
Thank
wonderful.
you so much.
Really enjoyed it. I seriously hope that we have more such interactions. And best wishes from me and from my team